Good morning. Welcome to chapel this morning on this beautiful summer morning. I want to thank our pianist, Chris Beery, and our tech person, Tim Ritchie Martin, and I am Doris Carpenter. And we're welcoming Cheryl Thomas as our speaker today. We'll be looking forward to her message. I did thank Chris for our beautiful piano music. And we will be ready to have chapel, and we welcome you here.
But it is always a joy to be here at Timbercrest. Oh, Chris, your music. Whew. I tried very hard not to cry. I mean, whew. My Jesus, I love thee. Whew. I could hear you singing along. So beloved. Well, I have my beloved husband with me today. We don't always come together, but we are no longer at Lincolnshire. We have since, quote unquote, retired, but you all know what that is. It just simply means we're not in the pastoral role at this point in time. So we are no longer driving from Fort Wayne. We are now driving an hour and a half from northern Indiana, which if you look outside our upstairs window, you can pretty much see the toll road. So that tells you how far north we are. We have not retired from ministry, and you all know that that is something that God never totally releases us from. I mean, when he gives you a calling, you go where he calls you. So my husband is presently the Northern Indiana District Moderator-elect, and I am serving on the ministry committee for that same district. But what we have been doing is we have been visiting a number of the churches in Northern Indiana, trying to see them all and visit all of them. But we took a quick break and came over to the Manchester Church, which is where my brother John Narr also attends, and his lovely wife, my wonderful sister-in-law, Bee. You may know John and Bee. So normally we would stay and visit with the wonderful Lincolnshire folk here, but we will be leaving and seeing my brother and be following this morning devotional. The songs we often sing that touch our hearts the most are those that are the most familiar. My Jesus, I love thee. I love thee. And the songs and the stories that touch our hearts are oftentimes those that we are most familiar with. So I'm bringing you a message this morning from the story of Joseph. Joseph is very familiar, but sometimes we don't always see and cover his entire journey. And a lot of times we stop with the end of Genesis. We all know that the story of Joseph follows the patriarchs in the book of Genesis, and it is Joseph's life that complete that particular book. So we are going to be discussing not only Genesis, but we're also, by the time we finish, we're going to touch on Exodus as well as move very quickly into Joshua. Because Joseph's story, when Joseph comes full circle in his life, it takes more than his lifetime. It takes 400 years. It takes 400 years to see Joseph come full circle. So we see that Joseph's life has meaning and movement for generation after generation after generation after generation. He was an amazing pebble that was dropped in the waters that spread out and continues on and on. And I want us to take hope and encouragement from that, because sometimes in our own life, we don't see our own lives come full circle, generation through generation. And yet something you may have done, something you may be saying today, may carry on further than you ever imagined. ever imagined. So not only do we draw hope from Joseph, but I want us to recognize that Jesus, and we talked about loving Jesus. My Jesus, I love thee. Jesus knew the story of Joseph. And Jesus derived much strength and encouragement, I'm sure, from the story of Joseph. I don't want you to think I did all this research on my own or came up with all these correlations. I'm going to give you a number of correlations between Joseph and Jesus. I did my research. I went to the internet and I looked and I looked and I looked, and I would tell you where all I found it, but there was too many different resources. You can literally find 60 plus correlations between Jesus and Joseph, and it blew my mind. And I so enjoyed that study that I literally made Joseph coming full circle to 30-minute sermons. But you don't have time for that today. So I'm going to give you the very abridged form. You know the story of Joseph's life, so I don't need to repeat that to you. But I want you to hear the similarities between Jesus and Joseph that I know my parishioners enjoyed so much hearing and understanding. We know the story of how Jacob has a well that he digs around the town of Shechem. Now, Shechem is a very important city because this is where also Abraham built an altar. He built two altars, one in Shechem and one in Bethel. So Shechem, which is in the heart of Samaria during Jesus's time, was a very key location, a very heart and beginning for the Israelites or the Hebrews. So when Jacob builds and digs this well, he's saying, I am establishing God's covenant here, and that water gives life to many. In fact, it gives so much life to many that Jesus, as you recall, he travels directly into Samaria and he goes to a well and he meets the woman at the well. And he declares there that he is the Messiah. That is where he first begins the announcement of who he is and what his ministry is. And that was Jacob's well. Jacob being Joseph's father. But horrible things happen at Shechem. And you're going to have to read that story. I don't have time to explain that to you. But so Jacob moves his family away, and God allows them safe passage to move away from Shechem. But all of a sudden, Jacob hears that his older sons, 10 of them, all mostly from Leah, have taken the sheep and are grazing near Shechem. And that just sends the hair soaring on the back of his head. Shechem, please, not there. And so he sends his eldest son, the only two who are left home are Joseph and Benjamin from his wife Rachel, right? So he sends Joseph to go check on the brothers at Shechem. And you know the story. Now, if you know the whole story, you know that Jacob sent Joseph into a hornet's nest. Those older sons decimated, killed off the king, the prince, and all the men of Shechem. And that's why Jacob fled. So his older sons are seasoned killers. And he is sending Joseph to go check on them. Imagine as Jesus recalls the story of Joseph and he sees the correlations with his own life. He sees what God is doing with him and for him. So one correlation we can see between Jesus and Joseph is that as Jacob sends Joseph to check on his brothers and to report back to him, likewise, Jesus was sent to earth to check on us, God's children. A second correlation is once sent on this mission, that's when Joseph's trials really began. Joseph's brothers plotted to kill him, not believing the dreams that Joseph shared with them. They stripped him of his cloak, covered it in goat's blood, and told father Jacob that Joseph was dead. Likewise, Jesus is called the Lamb of God. He had his cloak stripped and covered with his own blood. Third correlation. Joseph was sold into slavery at the proposal of his brother Judah. Jesus was betrayed by his spiritual brother and disciple Judas for 30 pieces of silver, which ironically is the cost of a slave. And 4, Joseph's bloody cloak was presented to his father Jacob. Likewise, Jesus is our scapegoat, and his blood was presented to our Holy Father as a sin offering. You can imagine that Joseph, as he was sitting in the bottom of the pit, who should have been protected by his brothers, heard instead his brothers saying, "Kill him, kill him. Why don't we just kill him?" The same shouts Jesus heard by the masses. Kill him, kill him. What we learn in this part of Joseph's life, we learn several life lessons. One lesson that we learn is that suffering, no matter how unfair, develops strong character and deep wisdom if we will just hang in there, if we will simply endure and allow God to do his work, because we know God can use anything. And the second main lesson we learn from Joseph in this first part of his life is that we are a part of God's plan. We are a part of God's plan. And what I love about Joseph is that he learns this. He learns these lessons. So we move into the second part of Joseph's life where, you know the stories. He was sold into slavery, he was imprisoned, he interprets the royal official dreams, he interprets Pharaoh's dreams, he's then appointed overseer, and then in the final account, he is united with his family. And so often we stop there and we say, what a happy ending. And we don't realize that there's still more to the story. There's still more to the story. But let's look at least that part. And I like thinking of that as part 2 of Joseph's life. And I'm going to tell you what the themes are right away. Is what matters is not so much the events or circumstances of life, but how we respond to them. So look at what happened to Joseph. How did he respond to that? And I'm sure Jesus, as he was going through his trials, thought back on Joseph and said, how did he deal with this? What did he do? Secondly, with God's help, Any situation can be used for good, even when others intend it for evil. And at the very end of Genesis, which is the 50th chapter, Genesis is very long, the 20th verse, we have, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." These are Joseph's words. You can imagine these were also Jesus's words. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." To accomplish what? Both Joseph and Jesus had the ability to see what God was doing with them at that present time. And that takes a lot of God trust, doesn't it? It takes a lot of deep wisdom to see what God is doing. And what did they both recognize? That the purpose for their lives was to save many other lives. That was their purpose. So I'm just going to share just a few more correlations because I think these are so wonderful. They both began their service at right around the age 30, 31. Both of them did. And I find that an interesting correlation. Another one, Joseph alone was seen dispersing grain. And what was the purpose of grain? What do you bake that into? We break that into bread. Joseph alone was seen dispersing bread to the perishing. Jesus likewise alone dispenses the bread of life. The bread of life. Another correlation. Joseph feeds the masses, including his brothers, including those who intended to kill him. Jesus likewise fed the masses. And there are 12 tribes and sons of Israel. And how many disciples did Jesus have? 12. So many interesting correlations. If you enjoy this piece, I encourage you to go to the internet and look at the other 40 to 50 correlations that actually occur. I mean, it is phenomenal. One thing that I love with lessons, again, is, and I just have to give these two more, that Joseph recognized that his suffering was a part of God's plan to save the nation of Israel. Likewise, Jesus was very aware that his suffering and death had a higher purpose. And last, just as Joseph comforted his brothers who had betrayed him, so Jesus comforted and comforts his disciples, his loved ones, even those who abandoned him at the cross. Now, we would think that's pretty much a sermon in itself, right? But I haven't given you part 3 yet. And I know you want to hear part 3, don't you? Yes, you do. Say yes. Okay. So what we recognize is it takes, and as I stated before, it takes 400 years for Joseph to make this full circle. So obviously he didn't see it occur in his lifetime. So where do we see this? Well, we see this in Genesis, first of all, Genesis chapter 50. You're welcome to follow along with me, or you can just listen. It's such a beautiful portion. I just feel the need to read the whole thing aloud because it's just so wonderful. This is at the time of Jacob's death. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "Well, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrong we did to him. So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you were to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs that they committed in treating you so badly. Now, please forgive the sins of the servants of God and your father. And when their message came to him, Joseph wept. What do we see Jesus doing? Several times, Jesus wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him, bowing down before him. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, and I love these words, we hear it from Genesis clear through the New Testament. Joseph says to them, don't be afraid. How many times do we hear that announcement through the angels? Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? In essence, am I God? I'm not one here to judge you. That is not my place, he's telling his brothers. You, and now you see it in context, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, and he says it again, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. What a thing. Joseph does more than forgive. I forgive you, he says. But not only that, I will care for you. I will care for you and your children. That takes quite a person, doesn't it? That takes quite a person of God. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Now you go on down, and he says to his brothers, he says, I am about to die. Joseph is on his deathbed, but God will surely come to your aid. He assures his brother that God is with him. And he goes into a bit of prophetic statement. He says, and God will come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and our father Jacob. And Joseph made the sons of Israel swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid. And then, when he does, you must carry my bones up from this place. Do not leave me in Egypt. Now, the thing is he's for sure their brothers are going back just within a couple of years. But that isn't what happens, is it? So Joseph died at the age of 110. And after that, they embalmed him, and he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. And he remains in Egypt for a very long time because the brothers do not leave Egypt. So then we go to the book of Exodus. And who's the leader of Exodus? But Moses. And this is just a side note. Moses is from the lineage of Leah. I don't think we always know that. We have Joseph, who saved Israel, coming from the wife Rachel, but from the wife of Leah, you go down several generations, Moses arises. So both women give an amazing leader. From Rachel, we have them saving them and taking them to Egypt. Through Leah, we have Moses taking them out of Egypt. And because it is Moses, this promise has passed down generation to generation to generation. So when Moses takes the Israelites and they leave Egypt, they take the Ark of the Covenant with them, but in another container, they take the bones of Joseph. And so often we forget that piece. So Joseph gets to travel through the desert for 40 years. Bet he didn't guess he would be doing that. But it isn't Moses who takes Joseph's bones into the promised land. As you recall, God takes Moses to the hillside and he shows him the promised land, but he says, you will not be entering. And Moses dies in the desert. Aaron, the high priest, dies in the desert. Miriam dies in the desert. It is a whole new generation that goes into the promised land, and that is Joshua. So I am concluding with what happens at that time in Joshua chapter 24, the very last chapter of that particular book. And Joseph's bones, which the Israelites had brought up from Egypt, were buried at Shechem. How amazing is that? I bet he didn't guess that would happen either. At Shechem, the very place he was betrayed by his brothers and sold into slavery, he is now buried there. But the beautiful part of that is, yeah, there's the bad side, but there's also the good side. This is where his father dug that well. This is where Jesus later will proclaim his ministry. Abraham built an altar here. This is a sacred place. Shechem. They bury him at Shechem in the tract of land that Jacob bought for 100 pieces of silver from the sons of Hamor, who was the king there at Shechem, and the father of Shechem. Shechem also had a prince named Shechem. This became the inheritance of Joseph's descendants. He inherits that portion of the land. Whoever would have guessed that? His descendants benefit from that exact area where he was betrayed. Joseph comes full circle. And I hope we gain encouragement from that, recognizing that we don't always see the pebble that's dropped in the water and how far our influences go. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father God, we just so appreciate you today, what you can do, how you use everything and anything that comes our way. And if anything is intended for harm, you mean it for good. So we thank you and we praise you and we continue to rely upon you. In your most holy and precious name, amen.